May I speak in the name of God, who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. The apostles said to the Lord, "Increase our faith." I suspect that there's not many Christians who at some time haven't made that same plea. I suspect that there's not many of us at all who haven't at some time struggled with our faith in one way or another. Increase our faith. And the reason that the disciples are making this plea is for us today chopped off at the start of our gospel reading at the beginning of chapter 17. The reason they need this increase in faith is because they think that Jesus has just asked them to do something quite impossible. That is, to forgive those people who wrong them. Not once, not twice, but as many times every single day as they're wronged, they are to forgive. Well, the disciples cannot imagine any way under their own steam that they could possibly manage such a heroic task. And so they say, increase our faith. Not teach us how to have more faith, but literally just pour it in, stick the cannula in, squeeze the bag. Just give us a transfusion of faith so that we might be able to act as you want us to. And Jesus' response to this request is quite puzzling. Firstly, he tells them about the extreme gardening that they'll be able to do if they've got a little bit of faith. You'll be able to tell this mulberry bush to uproot itself and plant itself in the sea. And then he goes on to tell them this seemingly quite unconnected story about the way in which we expect slaves to act towards their masters, and by analogy, the way that the disciples are meant to act towards God. Well, I put it to you that story, that second story about slavery, is not quite so far-fetched as it seems, and it's my intention today to prove it to you. But in order to do that, we need to backpedal a little bit first to look at the way in which Luke understands faith. Faith in the New Testament gets a new construction that we don't see anywhere in the Hebrew Scriptures, or we don't see in any contemporary writings either. New Testament authors start talking about faith in rather than faith that. So they say things like faith in Jesus as God, rather than faith that Jesus is God, which is a much more common way that the word faith would have been used in the Hebrew Scriptures and in contemporary literature. And you can hear the difference in those. One of them is much more personal and person-centered, faith in Jesus as God, and one of them is much more intellectual. It's a kind of creedal statement. It's a formulaic proposition, faith that Jesus is God. And it's this personal and person-centered approach that Luke takes. So for him, faith is primarily about recognizing who Jesus is, faith in Jesus as God. But there's a second strand as well, which is about recognizing who we are. Faith for Luke has some element of self-awareness. Take these examples of faith in Luke's gospel. The centurion who's got the sick servant. And the elders plead for Jesus to come to the centurion's house. But before Jesus even gets there, the centurion sends runners to say to him, look, I know who you are. I know that you have the power and the authority to heal my servant. You don't even need to come to my house. And I know that I can't do anything for my servant, that you're my only hope. I put all my reliance upon you. And Jesus says, not in all of Israel have I ever seen faith like this. And because of that faith, the centurion's servant is healed. The centurion recognizes who Jesus is, the authority that he has, and recognizes who he is, that he himself is incapable of saving his servant. Then take the woman who anoints Jesus' feet. Jesus is dining with Simon the Pharisee. And Simon either doesn't understand how important Jesus is, or he's got a very plumped up sense of self-importance, because he doesn't even offer Jesus basic hospitality. But this woman comes in quietly, and she throws herself at the mercy of Jesus at his feet in worship and adoration, and she pours out oil and she dries his feet with her hair. She recognizes who Jesus is and who she is and the appropriate relationship and response. And Jesus says of her, "Your faith has saved you." Or take Jesus' visit to his hometown, where we're told he could perform few miracles because there was little faith. And we're told that the people there couldn't recognize Jesus for who he was. They could only see the snotty-nosed boy, the carpenter's son, running around and playing with his mates. They couldn't see this man who was God. Because of their lack of faith, few miracles could be performed there. So faith for Luke is about firstly and primarily recognizing who Jesus is. And secondly, it's about recognizing who we are. And this, I think, is what Jesus is teaching his disciples in the second part of our gospel, in this story about slavery. And of course, this story is almost impossible for us to hear and to take away anything positive from at all. Its form is these rhetorical questions, and we want to offer answers quite counter to the answers that obviously we're meant to be answering. He says, "Who among you would say to your slave who's just come in from ploughing and tending sheep in the field, 'Come here at once and take your place at the table'?" And we want to say, yes, of course we would. You know, if they've been out hard working all day in the heat of the day, of course we'd say, "Come and sit with me and enjoy this meal." But the story only works if we say no. Who would thank their slave for doing what was commanded? And we want to say, well, of course, we thank everybody who does things that are nice for us. If anyone makes me dinner, I say thank you. But the story only works if we run under the assumption that we wouldn't bother thanking our slave for doing this. Now, there are two words that we translate servant and slave. The first is diakonos, from which we get the word deacon, which means servant, or literally somebody who waits at tables. And so every ordained deacon in the church is ordained to be a servant. And the other word is doulos, that we translate slave. And there's a fair bit of kind of crossover between the two of those, the ways in which they would have acted in that first century context. And what we're looking at in servanthood, or even in the institution of slavery, is not the kind of racially motivated subjugation that we saw take place in the United States and that we still see around the world. And we're talking about a time where there is very little, if any at all, critique of servanthood and slavery. It's a completely accepted and usual part of life. Now, that's not to say that it didn't oppress the most vulnerable. It did. And it's not to say that it wasn't deplorable and repugnant. It was. But it was a story and a narrative that the people that Jesus was speaking to would have been completely familiar with, and that they would have struggled to find any critique in. And it's also important to see who Jesus is speaking to in this story. He's not addressing the crowds. He's addressing his apostles. These are 12 free men who, just by the nature of their gender and the fact that they can give up their families and their livelihoods and follow Jesus, are already more powerful than most of their contemporary society. He's not saying to the least and the last, act as slaves. He's saying to these fairly powerful men, you are to act as you would expect a slave to act within your context. And these men are coming from a range of backgrounds. So there's Levi, Matthew, the tax collector, who was probably fairly rich, who might well have had servants and even slaves. there's fishermen, working men, who were less rich, but certainly enough that they had their own boats and their own nets. They would have employed day labourers. Certainly their dad would have employed day labourers when they left to follow Jesus. And maybe they would have aspired one day to have the status symbol of a slave. And what Jesus is saying to them in this passage is he's warning them against a kind of bookkeeping mentality in which they think they can run up some sort of credit balance with God. He's telling them that the slave's labour belongs to the master and that there's nothing that the slave can do to put the master into the slave's debt. He's saying that they cannot earn God's approval. They can't put God under some kind of obligation towards them. And he's telling them that the whole idea of merit is to be abandoned in the way that they engage with God. This is the God who has already freely given them life and endless love. And their best response is merely the minimum that can be expected from them. Jesus is telling his disciples to act as servants and slaves to one another, but not to act as masters. In another place, when they're arguing over who is the greatest, he says to them, you know what the leaders of the Gentiles do. They lord it over one another, but it's not to be so among you. Whoever wants to be first is to be the servant, and whoever wants to be the greatest of all is to be slave to all. And he goes on in Luke's Gospel later to say this to his disciples. Who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one at the table? And surely they would have thought back to this piece of teaching. They would have thought, yes, of course, it's the one at the table, like Jesus said. You don't invite your servant in, your slave in, and say, sit down next to me. You tell your slave, go and make my dinner for me because I'm more important. And then Jesus completely defied their expectations. He responds, but I am among you as one who serves. That even God in their midst is among them not as a master, but as one who serves. That they are all to be servants and slaves one to another, and none of them masters. And maybe that redeems the language of servanthood and slavery just a little. If we're servants and slaves one to another, but none of us act as masters, lording it over each other. What Jesus is explaining to his disciples is who they are and who God is, and the appropriate relationship between the two. And once they can get that straight in their minds, then this increase of faith that they're desiring will be seen in their lives. It's about having the right perspective. But nevertheless, they struggle. These are the same disciples who have enough faith at Jesus' calling to leave behind their families and the economic security of their jobs and to follow him. And these same people who displayed this amazing faith, when the storm hits the lake and it starts getting a bit choppy, they're the ones who lose all of their faith completely and shake Jesus awake and say, why are you leaving us to die? And these same disciples who show such lack of faith are the same ones who, when Jesus says, we're going to Jerusalem and I'm going to be killed, say, we're coming with you. And the same ones who set their sight on Jerusalem and the cross are the ones who, when they get there, get frightened and run away. And these same ones who run away and deny Jesus are the ones who, after his resurrection and ascension, carry his word to the ends of the earth and even die for their faith. And perhaps not so extremely, but I suspect many of us can see the same ups and downs of our faith journey in that story. Those times when faith comes to us easily and when we do great works of belief, and those times when faith departs from us, when we're frightened. And the thing about those down times, those times when we're struggling, is that it's very easy for us to convince ourselves in those moments, well, maybe I never had that faith at all. It's that thing that humans don't really like very much, cognitive dissonance, when we believe two opposing and contradictory statements, and we feel the anxiety of that very uncomfortably, and we want to try and get rid of it. It's where the phrase sour grapes comes from. Aesop tells this story of a fox who saw hanging from the vine a bunch of delicious, juicy, sweet grapes. And the fox thought, obviously he didn't know very much about what foxes like to eat, but the fox thought, I would love some of those grapes. And the fox, it jumps up and it can't get them. And it takes a running start and it jumps up and it still can't get high enough. And it tries to climb up the tree, but the bark is too shiny and slick and it can't get up to these grapes. And it looks back up at them and it says, I bet they were sour anyway. I didn't really want them in the first place. To try and reduce that anxiety it's feeling between the fact that it wants something and it can't have it, it says, well, I probably never wanted it anyway. And we do often the same thing with our faith. We can fall into that same temptation when, on the one hand, we're frightened about something, and on the other hand, we're thinking, but I know by faith this is something which I should not fear. That contradiction unsettles us. We feel anxiety and we think, well, maybe I never had that faith at all. Maybe I'm quite right to be frightened about this. Maybe that faith that I imagined I once had was never there. We try and do something to settle and ease that cognitive dissonance. Well, I suggest to you that the next time that you're struggling with faith, it's helpful to ask these couple of questions. Where is God in this situation? How do I recognize Jesus within this? And where am I within this situation? How do I recognize myself within this? How can I put things into perspective between, on the one hand, the gracious God who has bestowed upon me endless love, and on the other, I who have been called to willingly serve? And then we, like the disciples, might see that increase in our faith. So if you're struggling with your faith at the moment, or if over the coming week or month you find a time when you're really finding it hard to believe, take a moment to step back and to search for that perspective, to ask, where is God in this? Where am I in this? Who is God in this? And who am I? And you might just find that, like the disciples, you get an increase of faith too. Amen.